Welcome back to Neon Galactic and our third installment in the Rethink series, where we gather together as many bright minds as possible from the various fields of related interest to bridge gaps in the UFO topic and encourage cohesion. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. This is a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Keat TV, and today's show will be co-hosted by Dr. Chris Avis from Camosun College in British Columbia. Our guests today are some of the leading lights in the UFO, UAP, NHI conversation, and they come from across the spectrum in terms of interest and approach. David Stuss is a science educator and experiencer, also hailing from Camosun College, and he's a close friend of the podcast and part of our rather brash and brilliant brain trust. He's been on a previous episode, and I encourage folks check that out. Robin Lassiter is an author, experiencer, and podcaster who's been on this show twice before. Check out her Earth, A Love Story book and podcast if you want to get an intimate understanding of how the phenomenon works, a transformative function in people's lives. Nick Gold is a UAP political activist and strategizer who has done amazing and important work in the push for disclosure and in helping to mainstream this topic in the national political conversation. He's the founder and rocket engine behind Declassify UAP, and among other things, offers members of the public direct and effective ways of helping to urge this topic forward. And Nathan from Liminal, Phrames and Calling All Beings podcasts is a thought leader in the subject whose knowledge and grasp of the phenomenon is deep and many-layered. He, like myself, seems drawn to how the UAP subject is telling us something pivotal and necessary about the nature of human consciousness and reality. It's an absolute pleasure to have everyone here on this show and to explore a topic that just at this moment of history seems poised to blow up and potentially transform several important aspects of our collective life on this planet. At least to me, it seems like at some point in the past several months, we crossed over into a new reality where so many of our sense-making rules no longer apply. As Chris and David and I have discussed, author and ethnobotanist Terence McKenna often spoke of his novelty theory and how mounting absurdities would point the way like nonsensical road signs toward the end of time. Given the rash of recent developments around this topic, politics generally, the rise of AI, etc., his comments are seeming more and more prescient every day. Just a couple days ago, an American serviceman blew himself up in a Cybertruck outside Trump Tower and apparently left notes linking his immolation with anti-gravity drones, an unfolding Chinese invasion, Area 51, and war crimes in Afghanistan. Add in several more billionaires, a changing administration, hijinks on the interweb, and a looming threat of nuclear holocaust, and there you've got the set and setting for today's conversation. Thanks, everyone, for coming on the show.
Thanks.
Thank you, James. Good to be here.
So, yeah, it's a pleasure to have you guys. I'm a fan of each and every one of you, so this is an honor to be able to host this conversation and to do so with Chris, who is my co-host and good friend. Chris, did you have any opening remarks you wanted to make before we got to the meat?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, and quite apart from all the political turmoil that's going on in the world right now, is it does feel, as kind of an observer of the field, that the field itself seems very much at a crossroads where, there's been a lot of hopes pinned in recent years on disclosure efforts through the US political machinery, which hasn't quite panned out the way the community had hoped. And I would say a lot of energy spent focusing on, let's say, big voices in the field, many of whom are connected with the intelligence community. And it feels as though we haven't quite gotten maybe the movement forward that we'd have hoped. And so it feels a little bit like an open question to the field about how to proceed. And also, as James has mentioned, a lot of current events seem to be at least tangentially touching the UFO community, which makes us ripe for perhaps some degree of manipulation. And I think it's a really good time to have a discussion around how our field can proceed and grow in a healthy way. So I'm really excited to have everyone here. Grateful that you made the time.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. So let's just start off with a little bit of a kind of a roundtable to get everyone's and get everyone on the record here. From each of your perspectives, why don't you guys start with what you think are the most important things to watch for right now as we're in this moment and we're changing presidents and there is some momentum on the disclosure front, but maybe not as much as we hoped. I mean, it's all such a jumble. But Nathan, why don't you start? If you can sort of talk about what you think are sort of the important points to be watching out for and what you think are some of the important things going on.
Sounds good. Thanks, James. And thanks for having me on. It's good to be with you guys. Really looking forward to this conversation. So
With all the things that have happened at the end of 2024 and what we've started to see happen at the beginning of 2025, what I'm looking to see is really the social conversation and how that conversation continues to unfold in the face of not just what I would call sort of the normal disclosure pathways that we would expect through congressional movement, that kind of thing, but also through the reaction of society to strange, anomalous things, whatever they may be. And how do we metabolize the anomalous just generally? And I think this is becoming a more and more pressing and important issue. Not just we can take the phenomena out of the equation, but just in terms of information and disinformation, misinformation, the information space that all of us find ourselves in every single day is a soup, really. It's just a congested soup of things. And to have to make heads and tails of that information and kind of craft a cohesive narrative about what is my picture of the world? How do I understand my story and my place within that story? These are becoming very difficult, harder to do as we are bombarded by all these kinds of different competing stories and information and narratives. And so I'm looking to see kind of how does society grapple with the task that what we've been pretty good at doing historically, and that's things like localized narrative making. I know who I am. I place myself within my family, within my community, within a larger community from there, or my nation state or whatnot, but into the global community. And now that global community is kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of different competing stories, and where facts are really hard to come by, and where competency is also really difficult to come by. And we're finding that our leaders, our governmental leaders and authorities are trying to project competency, but that competency is not being well received by those that are normally would take it in and go, ah, yes, that is what is happening. That must be the story. Whatever the officials are telling me, that must be what it is. So we're seeing a change in that behavior, I think, societally. And I'm looking to see kind of how does that continue to unfold, particularly if more and more anomalous activity continues. And I don't think all of the recent activity that has been happening, and here I'm talking about the drone things and recently is this bombing. I don't think it's necessarily anomalous, but the stories around what it is certainly seem to be anomalous, and that's really taking a lot of energy in the conversation right now.
And that's a great point. And it's like when we're all sort of wrestling with what is anomalous and what's not, and certain people are saying everything is anomalous and others are sort of rejecting any notion of the anomalous, how do we even begin to confront what's actually at, bedrock reality when we can't ever agree in the conversation? Anyway, yeah, that's great, great points. Thank you. Nick, let's go to you. I mean, what do you think is important? You can also respond to what Nathan had to say. He seems to be echoing some of the things that you said before we got started.
Yeah,
So,
no, I totally agree with all of those points. And we just, as we were talking about, it's essentially the most impossible age that we know of to be good consumers of information and to count on, what you're able to pluck out of this vast and highly bizarre, information space that is both society and the internet, and how we're all essentially linked cyborgs at this point. And this stuff has been foretold for a long time. I think people saw this coming, and we have to just, first of all, fully acknowledge it's not coming, it's not out there, it's not a future potential threat. It's fully the realm that we inhabit at this point. So people need to quickly learn how to be better consumers of information. And it's tough when 1,000 different narratives are emerging. You have large language models that blow through the Turing test. You have these abilities to automate this. We know that nation states that have leaders or rulers for decades at a time can enact long-term planning around how to utilize these changing landscapes most effectively, whereas in more ostensibly free societies, we have this constant turmoil and internal bickering and things that are intentionally to kind of hold up too much power, necessarily being in just one set of hands, and for it to be kind of society participating in how we do things. But that's kind of a disadvantage in this realm, and it's all happened so quickly. We're just really smack dab in the middle of it. So I encourage people, you know part of being a good consumer of information, in fact the core of it, isn't knowing inherently how to say definitively what is not. This is definitely the correct narrative. This guy's totally full of it. Like, it's not to make the definitive decisions. It's to operate more comfortably in the realm where you kind of look at that space of possibilities and are
Yeah,
comfortable
yeah, yeah,
sort of
yeah.
being in the state of superposition in
Which is,
terms
I
of,
mean,
you know?
not to interrupt you, but that's how we should be looking at this whole conversation of UFOs and more broadly everything, which I think is a
Well, I
crucial
think it's the
point.
right way of like living, first of all, but it
Yeah, yeah,
certainly is extremely exacerbated in these kinds of scenarios.
yeah.
With things turning every day and new news stories, and I think probably a lot of us here imagine that we are just at the beginning of this next several year cycle. A few weeks away, a lot of things are just going to start coming at us daily because we lived through, the first administration of Trump, and we know what that was like, and we can count on it being probably, just more chaotic. We have to look at the patterns themselves as well. And, instead of saying this guy has the whole thing, look for communities of people who kind of are having the more nuanced conversations, generally respect one another, have a reasonable way of comporting themselves, are, I think, open and honest about who they are, their biases, their backgrounds, who they, the institutions they're part of, and learn to kind of examine how those types of people examine this information space, the kind of dialogues, debates, because debates should be the focus in many ways, and we should be able to have very nuanced conversations when so many possibilities seem to be at play. And again, many people are kind of honed at this point to want to latch onto this or that. It's often dichotomized, if not completely just bifurcated into this completely dualistic notion of what's going on at a given moment. And I just think this is the wrong way to navigate complex issues in general. So look for the cool people who seem to be capable of getting along and they're having the cool conversations, and then try to, incorporate the patterns of how such communities of people are interpreting the information space. And I think you'll at least have a leg up on it versus going in with, digital cult outlook of the day. I don't think that gets people very far.
That was outstanding. Thank you very much for that. It's interesting to me, and you had hinted at this a little bit earlier before we started recording, that how much of that confusion and inundation of information is by design and to make for manipulation, which I think is, obvious that there is that element at play. And also tribalism plays into this. A lot of times people plug into their tribes and they expect those tribes, even though they may be oriented toward football or whatever else, to dictate their opinions about everything else. And that, doesn't lead to an educated engagement or dialogue because, who are they getting their opinions from? That's all great points. Thank you for that.
Nick,
Robin,
sorry, could
uh,
I just interrupt for a sec there, James? I was
yeah.
wondering if Nick could expand again. He was starting to talk just before we started the pod about hypernormalization, which I thought was really significant. Would you mind just
No, absolutely. And I was thinking about that, David, as James was talking. People need to be cognizant that one of the main goals of kind of, conditioning the populace to accept kind of a disinformational state of reality is not necessarily to get, a group of people on board with one particular false view. It's to flood the information space with so much chaotic and even conflicting information and perspectives that the outcome is really intended for the public, the populace, the targeted population to just kind of detach from even thinking there is a consensus reality to arrive at and we can make decisions around, and I should feel motivated to work with other people towards common goals because you don't believe that there's really even any way for anybody to understand one another or what's going on in the world. So, you know, when you see conversations that have several very kind of, I think, specific and staid and bifurcated perspectives that are kind of being presented, it's either this, it's either that. People need to understand that extreme, those some of those more extreme views that seem like they're coming from separate perspectives, they might all actually be coming from the same source. And the goal is to get us to look at issues in those particular, presented on a platter sets of terms, versus coming to a more nuanced set of understandings about what's going on, and finding community with people who have a cohesive way of interpreting these things, which again is to kind of operate in this state where you are okay with maybe different things being the case. It's a different way of sort of surfing through life. I mean, it's almost kind of a spiritual or philosophical outlook on some level, and I think this era probably calls for it as sort of a certain just a daily life requirement, more than any other I can think of. It was easier to just kind of like live and let live as a kid in the 80s or whatever, or high schooler in the 90s, right?
Yeah, sort of an intellectual hygiene practice or something. Yeah, so Robin, it seems like we've got off on information and that sort of thing, but the original question was about what you think is important for us to be thinking about in the phenomenon, and that was an answer, which is an important answer. You can continue on with that, or you can talk about something that you think has been neglected in terms of the broader picture.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really have a lot of resonance with what Nathan and Nick both said, and it's been my way of navigating experience in general. I know others here, lifelong experiencers, and being presented with things that push us into paradox and liminality, and being unable to kind of plant a flag somewhere and say, this is what this is, because as soon as we do that, the phenomenon slips around that. And, so I think that for me and my work and like my perception of this, what I'm seeing are people, individuals that are affected. I'm in experiencer communities, and it feels like many people have just started to come to terms with their own experiences, and now they're seeing it reflected in a wider way. And what feels really important is that we find some sort of, as both Nathan and Nick have said, some sort of like navigation system that widens the aperture and helps us be able to hold more of what's coming through, to hold without sort of collapsing the narrative into this or that. And as part of that, a lot of my work is with the body and with being a human on this planet, and how do we like work with our nervous systems, and how do we work with relationality in our communities, and finding the importance of both trusting personal experience, with the caveat that knowing that even if I see it with my eyes, there may be something that's not, it's hard to plant a flag there as well, but working with personal experience and also working with relationality so that we begin to trust our close communities, or at least have trust in real relationships that are built, so that I'll just say personally, going through this last couple of months and watching these things happen through the medium of my screens, finding myself sort of wobbly and going, oh, this person really seems to think that this is this, and this person thinks that this is this, and how do I know what I'm seeing is reality? And having at this point, I feel like it's a blessing, having the experience of seeing things with my eyes outside my window at night, so having that perspective as well. And then triangulating that and figuring out what is the most important thing, which to me at this point seems to be staying stable and grounded and open to possibilities, and connected with smart, safe people who are having these conversations. And so it's very similar to what both Nick and Nathan were saying. Yeah. All of this is coming through our bodies. And I think that that's a really, like for me, I don't know the answers. I can't look out and see. I have ideas. I come up with things that I think are happening, but I don't know the answer. And so how can I sort of help myself stay grounded in this liminal open space and not be subjected to just ontological shock after ontological shock? And that is a journey that for me is a developmental and spiritual journey that is constantly unfolding, and it's tricky. So I will be looking for, I'm doing a lot less external seeking and a lot more looking close to the body, close to personal relationships and conversations in communities like these.
Fantastic. David, do you want to take a shot?
Would you do me the kindness of asking the original question again. So I've had so many interesting thoughts listening to everybody else.
No, yeah, at this point it's anything you want, but we were basically I started with what you think are the important things that we need to be watching for in the UFO topic and in the community, and that maybe have been neglected by the broader, conversation, or you can just respond to some of the other brilliant things that have been said because it's already going, man.
Sure,
Good
sure.
people.
I think what Robin was just saying is a nice transition. As far as how I've been looking at it from uh, about what's significant, we could look at it from the more social community cultural point of view. I've been looking at it more from the point of view of the significance to the individual, and it seems to me that there's something, if I was to look at it from as a bird's eye view as possible, it's like the human being, the general human nervous system, if we like, is being sort of forced into a confrontation with how it relates with reality. And I think as many of us have said so far, it seems like one of the main challenges that is being presented is, are we going to approach life from a single ontological perspective or shift into something which is a little bit more like I guess a psychedelic state in which you have to learn how to not hold on to any particular perspective tightly. And so one of the notions that we've been discussing in our private conversations is this idea of like metaphysical optometry. If you've ever gone to have your vision tested, and that the optometrist will say, which is going to give you a clearer perspective, this lens or this lens. And we can look at that from the point of view of how are we going to engage with anything which is being presented to us. Is there some particular lens that we can use that will establish clarity for whatever is being presented, or can we abandon it and shift into something else? So, yeah, I think this. I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, yeah. We love the metaphysical optometry idea, the switching lenses as the need arises. And that was your brainchild, by the way, David. We talk about it, but you came up with it. Chris, do you have anything you want to add to that, or do you have a question you want to ask?
Yeah, and I'm still pontificating on a lot of what folks have raised, but one of the underlying themes I've heard so far is around narrative. And I think, speaking of metaphysical optometry, one of the things that gets bandied around a lot in the UAP sphere these days is around ontologies, in particular around sort of like an idealism focused universe where quite literally, this all be maybe mind focused, and you could envision that literally the narratives that you are holding may have some kind of causal effect on reality versus simply a materialism driven world where we are now subject to psychological manipulation to a degree that's unfathomable a few years ago even. So ultimately, it can also feel a bit disempowering as an individual when you feel these very large scale forces, billionaires or the deep state or whatever, potentially manipulating things. How, as individuals, do we influence our own narrative? And I heard a little bit about this with like spiritual hygiene. I'm wondering, for you folks, what are you doing to maintain some degree of autonomy and to find a good narrative to live your life amid all of this noise? That's a coherent question. And also, I'll throw in there, can we look to other communities, perhaps more spiritual communities that have been grappling with these questions for thousands of years?
Who do you want to start?
Yes. Short
Nick
answer,
said something.
yes.
Yeah, yeah. Go, Nick.
I love it when people say there's a consciousness angle, because if this kind of idealistic or non-dualistic view of reality, or panpsychism, whatever label you want to slap on it, but if that view ends up panning out, there really wouldn't be an angle that isn't a consciousness angle, right? They'd all be consciousness angles. It would all be angles within consciousness. So I just think that's important. That longer term set of perspectives is very useful. They didn't have social media of the sort we have in 2025. Crazy to even say that we live in the year 2025.
I know.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was reading Cyberpunk in the early 90s. I was like, oh my God, it's going to be so crazy. And I'm like, It's crazy.
I'm still pissed that the hoverboard didn't show up by 2015. I mean, Back to the Future.
Maybe the deep state's been hiding them away from us because there would be
Yes,
too many
exactly.
I'm
injury lawsuits
disappointed
or
that
something.
Well, it is anti-gravitic, right? So I mean, there we go. It's all tied
But
together.
I think, it's like, look at the space we navigate. Like, these, for some reason, Gnosticism is sort of like a meme, and it frankly is very reinforcing of certain dualistic ways of looking at the world, in my opinion. But it's like almost a gateway drug to people kind of pondering metaphysical and philosophical perspectives, and starting to kind of come to that more Western sense of, like, we live in this illusionary reality, but what Hindus would have called Maya, right? And that's kind of being rebirthed in this information age, is the simulation theory and all of this. But, like, we can look at thousands of years of how human beings across cultures and environments and times and lands and everything, also was treading this territory, because it's not really new landscape, these UAP themes or NHI themes. I mean, it's like what most societies have been based around for thousands of years based on the evidence we have. So, those longer term views and going really wide with it, and not saying, okay, I'm just going to, like, focus in on Gnostics because that's a buzzword I saw on the webs, but, like, okay, let's look at how a variety of cultures looked at, interactions with potential greater beings or cosmic beings, et cetera, et cetera. Earth spirits, things from the oceans, whatever it might be. Like, these things have been tread before. Um, and then, don't feel locked into picking one and saying that's the right one. But it's like, it gives you that kind of landscape to even begin to navigate the issues of the day, which are largely the same, just hyper magnified in this crazy, funhouse set of mirrors we've erected for ourselves.
Yeah. I have an interesting follow-up question to that. One of the things that you see in the ongoing political debate surrounding UAPs is that there has been people, and I'm thinking of Kirkpatrick for one, who said that what's going on with UFOs is the result of this UFO cult that's brewing in the Pentagon, and so it's a spiritual thing that's rearing its illogical head, and it's sort of converting all these people. The topic does seem to push people eventually to get to this place where they're entertaining ideas that have been verboten for rationalists for a long time, whether it's idealism or recognizing that there may be some sort of non-physical reality, whatever you want to call it. How do we entertain both notions, that being a reality and everything else associated with UAP, and be on the fringes, while not pushing a bunch of people away who are automatically going to reject the notion of there being some sort of religious, element to it, because immediately the alarms go off. It's like people think of the sneakers on a bed, with the Heaven's Gate cult, where they all killed themselves because some guy said he was waiting for a UFO abduction. So how do we entertain these spiritual notions without setting off other people's alarm bells if we want to mainstream this topic? Nathan, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I'll try. That's not an easy one, but I think this is definitely an important issue. It's an incredibly challenging one because we live in a mix of many generational viewpoints right now. We've got folks that are in the boomer generation, the silent generation, who looked at the world in a certain specific way, and what we're talking about here, kind of being very open to lots of different ways of looking at reality. That can be a little bit uncomfortable for some in those generations, and so we need to have that cross-generational conversation. But how do we do it? How can we arise at a place where we might have a common language, and maybe reaching that state isn't really the goal we should be striving for anyway? I mean, I think largely we're talking a lot about these sort of changes in epistemology. What can we know? What can actually be known? What's the importance of rightness, correctness generally? I think we can all point to examples where being correct is valuable. Everything we're doing right now is reliant on someone figuring something out and it being correct and it being repeatable, so that we can have these amazing exchanges through technology. But our experiences, and this is something, I want to come back to kind of what Robin said, that, what we feel in our bodies and what we experience in our lived lives, it's different and sometimes at odds with this need to feel correct, right, pin everything down, to quantize everything. And so we're really we're at a juxtaposition in some ways between the inner life that we have that is full of a variety of opinions and perspectives. And I used to kind of think of this as sort of like there's a quantum, superposition of our ideas that I don't really know what I'm thinking until you ask me in certain ways, right? So, and we should be able to be charitable with one another in extending that kind of openness instead of saying, I know that so and so said this, and therefore they must be X. So how do we kind of breed that type of charity societally? And I think it's really difficult. It's difficult to do that, but I would remind everyone that practicing that kind of charity, that kind of openness to different perspectives, different ideas, is what you would want someone to extend to yourself, right? These are classic ideas that have been around forever, but we're really bad at practicing them. But when people get on their high horses and kind of really want to, sort of crucify somebody, they often aren't willing to take the heat when someone points that back at them. And so we need to have some self-reflection. And do we have institutions now that actually create opportunities for us to do that? Do we have places that foster and instill and propagate these notions of grace and charity and community? I'm not sure that we do. I mean, we all joke about the Thanksgiving dinner where we have to begrudgingly sit next to our crazy uncle and we have to get along. Well, I mean, maybe just embrace that. Like, that's okay. That is the human story. It's a lot of, varied, wild viewpoints. And at some point in that story, a certain viewpoint is in fact more valuable than another. And in another point in that story, that viewpoint is not valuable. And so we have to be willing to say, you know what, conservative friend, liberal friend, whatever it may be, I might disagree with you, but I could see that perspective at a certain time would be the perspective that we in fact should have. And so I can see that there's validity to that, even though I myself don't feel pulled towards that particular polarity in decision making. So this is really difficult, and I don't know how we get there because we are living at a time where there just isn't a structure, a narrative that we can kind of get behind that allows us to reach that type of consensus.
Brilliantly said.
Agreed.
And what I hear you saying is almost like maintaining a healthy ecosystem of ideas or ontologies. And it is one of the things that I have said found helpful about this topic, the fact that it brings in people from the left and for the right. And it has caused me to reevaluate people whom I otherwise would have dismissed based on their politics. So that is, speaking of healthy things that our community can model, I think that's brilliant. And as in nature, monocultures are not terribly healthy. They're vulnerable. Maintaining that balance is critical. So thank you for that.
And it's hard, especially in these moments right now where we have, it seems like, a social media culture that's actively driving us all apart. And it's also sort of become the worshiping of opinion, so that you become identified with your opinions rather than your humanity, so that when people disagree with you, you sort of exclude them from your life, or you define them by that opinion, and you can't ever come to terms with their commonality, and that's I mean, before it seemed like you would have in a small community, say you'd have a bunch of people, and some people would have extravagant opinions, and they might be, judged toward on the surface, but their, overall belongingness in that community or their overall humanity sort of always bridged that gap. And now we're not encountering people on that level. We're only hearing about their opinions. So it just drives us further and further apart, which is unfortunate.
I almost hear
So,
something in what Nathan was just raising there, is that almost like what's at stake is a way of being that is beyond identity, right? So it's like that in a sense. That's almost like what we're being asked to learn. Like, can you live without being anyone? And then, depending on what the circumstances require in your community, sort of pick up different perspectives as they're needed. It seems if there's any, uh, something which lies at the root of many of the challenges that seem to confront us, it's when we've got different individuals or groups of people who are deciding that they're this and not that, and from that, polarization and conflict arises. Whereas if you had the freedom, to be like, well, what's most appropriate in the current circumstance, none of those issues might arise.
that's difficult in this moment because we are obsessed with identity on a bunch of different levels, and in some ways, rightfully so, and in others, I think it is problematic for our society. But that's interesting.
I just want to say, David, I think that, I mean, you've really spawned instantly a lot of thoughts in my head with that statement. And, like many people would look at the existing state of things as like just a mess or a morass, but it is an invitation, and I will profess to being a kind of non-dualist philosophically and have been for pretty much my whole life. Um, it is the ultimate invitation to operate in that phase where, again, coming back to consciousness angles, but like, yeah, we understand that our lived lives are composed of labels and situations and things like that, but like and those are gonna kind of come into conflict or this or that, and the ups and downs and all of it will play out, but for people broadly, so we can live in a state of tolerance, as Nathan was, I think, speaking to, just with half of the other people that live in my country say, that we need to also increasingly learn that, again, like what I really am is consciousness. Like, for some reason that just came to me in elementary school. I was like, why aren't we talking more about how we're actually the thing that's looking out through this thing versus thinking of us as this thing? And I just didn't get it. But if even people of a diversity of opinions can come into that kind of that sense of things that could be the uniter, because that consciousness is very basic. It doesn't have labels. It's the thing that's kind of beyond labels. Maybe it's the heart of all things, as has been said in many traditions. But maybe that gives us a path to kind of living in the realm of Maya and information and relationships and labels and all of these things, but kind of get to a deeper level with other people who might live very different types of lives than us and say, we are this other thing that's seems kind of common to everyone and maybe even everything. So we just got to chill a little bit. And, it's tough because I think there are people who are wired to be very okay with living in diverse societies and tolerating people who live other types of lives. The problem is a lot of people increasingly seem to be going in the other direction, where it's you have to live this very particular way, and we're going to kind of make sure that the system is geared up to enforce that. And that's really challenging because it's that old debate about how can you maintain tolerance of intolerance, especially when it wants to quash the other things. So it's a difficult place to navigate, but David's point is one that I think everyone could meditate on, because it's like that thing that brings us all together is what is beyond those conflicting states of information. If that's an impossible state to arrive at consensus at, we need to arrive at consensus around something deeper, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's a message that we could all draw, and I mean that's sort of what I'd like to push forward through my show and everything else in these conversations. I think that that's a vital point to all the things that we've been talking about.
And I just want to say, and maybe invite her if she wants to espouse on the point. Robin, I really enjoyed what you said about, someone who's had quote unquote outlier, mystical, metaphysical, experiences, et cetera, et cetera. And being willing to not even feeling you need to come to a specific conclusion about what the ultimate nature of those experiences means, and to operate in an open-minded state, because I think a lot of people are trying to kind of get away from it. It's why we latch on to wanting to kind of have the way of viewing the world and wanting to kind of enforce that in some certain circumstances. But like that willingness to not even have to do that in your own life, I think that's just a really valuable point. And there is, I think, a place you can come into comfort with that. Would you mind sharing a little bit more just about how you navigate that without going into any specifics if it's not, something you want to get into, but broadly?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm enjoying this conversation with all of you so much. Yeah, I will say that I came at it kicking and screaming, to be honest, and that path does inform what I think about what the collective is going through now. I really wanted to know what it was, and I really wanted to narrow it down, and I really wanted to figure it out. And so I for my personal sort of development and maturation, I've come to the ability to hold broader space because it actually does function much better. And but it isn't without like the desire to know. I want to know. I want somebody to tell me the answer. I want to have the answer, even better. It's like, well, the beings told me this, and clearly that's true across all cases. And now I can tell everyone, let's just do this way, and then it's going to work out. But that's not the case. And so I think that I've said this, and it's why I'm excited, even though the world feels really messy and chaotic right now, and their realities seems to be cracking, without bypassing the real suffering that is possible at moments like this, for many, many people. I'm excited by what the UFO basically is doing to our materialist culture. It's like it is pushing us through this hero's journey or descent of Anana, basically, going into the underworld, facing these things, coming out changed, and requiring us to grow into a new space. And it eludes, that's the brilliance of it, is of the phenomenon in general, is that it eludes our desires to have things simple and put into simple boxes. So for me, it was that journey, and it continues to be the journey of holding it lightly and not collapsing the narrative. And I will say as well, just back to the points that were made a little bit earlier in terms of how we, in terms of sort of the either or and identity, and how we're judging each other based on certain aspects of identity, and how that's doesn't feel like it's going to work for very much longer. And I know that I'm in bubbles. Like, I'm very much aware that I'm in my algorithmic bubble, and I'm also surrounded by people having these conversations who, have very sophisticated views on these things. And also in a broader sense, I feel the fatigue of all of us, in terms of, people in my life who have been very much on one side and saying not nice things about quote unquote the other side. And suddenly, for whatever reason, they seem to be saying, well, I'm really tired of seeing people this way, or I'm tired of it being this either or conversation. So even though I know that I have this limited view, and on a broader scale, these, they're very real things happening as a result of becoming more and more polarized, I'm also seeing a response to that and a reaction to that, which I think is happening in real time right now with this conversation, that we're able to have, or we're just desirous of something more. And I think that that's what this is pushing us towards. So yeah, thank you for the question. And to answer it, I don't know how, that's my fear for watching the collective go through this is that I know how hard it is to go through sort of the journey of having reality crack and needing to then make sense of that and find a way to be in the world. And it is the spirit, for me, it was, I found spiritual traditions that talk about love and compassion, and that we're all one thing. And so with that with the sort of safety of that and the relationality of that, finding a way through that does as the least damage possible to self and other. But I think it's going to be very messy, but I'm very hopeful because of that, because I think this is what it's driving us to, is to mature as a species, or maybe just the West, right? Just from materialism to mature out of that paradigm into something else.
Thank you for that. It sort of leads me to another issue I wanted to talk a little bit about. You were mentioning sort of, one side talking about the other side, and I went to the Soul Conference, the Soul Symposium, and it was fantastic. I had a wonderful time. Got to talk to a lot of fantastic people. There were people there who were put off a little bit about some elements of the Soul Conference in terms of the presence of venture capitalists and how it all seemed geared toward commercialization and the commodification of both the phenomenon and the technology and all of that. And there was a feeling among some that experiencers were being kept at sort of a distance. There was some inclusion, but that wasn't the focus of what was going on. And frankly, I was like, I would have liked to have seen more of that kind of thing myself. And I walked out of there feeling like, capitalists are everywhere and kind of frustrated with that notion. But then, like, over time, as I've gotten away from it and I've had other discussions, and then I just watched this great podcast called the Ecosystemic Futures Podcast that just came out not that long ago. Anyway, really fantastic, by Anne Brady Estevez, and it had a bunch of prominent scientists like Hal Puthoff and Larry Forsley, and they were all talking about the need for venture capitalists to get involved to fund science and everything else. And it made me just realize that like that's going to be an absolutely pivotal part of moving forward on this topic, whether we like it or not. I mean, it's going to be the engine that manifests, the reality of this because people want to make money, and so that's going to dedicate a lot of resources toward finding out what's at root. And even though that might be, uncomfortable for some of us, I think that we need to figure out how to coexist in this space and allow room for both, and understanding that both are necessary. What are your thoughts on that whole situation and issue, Robin? I mean, we'll start with you since you were just so eloquent about the experiencer's experience.
Yeah. I I feel I sort of gave up on wanting or thinking that experiencers will be the center of this conversation for a while, right? Like I don't, I think that I think the topics are too weird, that there's the absurdity is too high, the difficulty with, the overarching culture trying to make sense of things that are direct conflict with each other. I think that I don't think, I'm not holding my breath, right? But what that has done is given me an opportunity to feel into my own, my own views on things and direct my own path rather than be in sort of reaction to, or feeling for or against this other thing that's happening.
Yeah.
It's sort of a big concept, but if I'm still in relationship to what I perceive as power or the people that are holding the powerful narrative, then I'm still, if I'm still sort of reacting to that, then I'm still asserting their power, if that makes sense. So I think that there's so many there's so many threads that need to be woven together in all of this. I'm not anti any of that. It is not my path. It's not my way forward, but I've sort of withdrawn my attention and energy from it, and I'm putting it elsewhere because even being in reaction to it or fighting against it seems to feed it in some way. So I do think I'm a very like yes and person, even though I have no control over these things anyway. But rather than being like, no, you need to stop that and we all need to look this way, I do think it speaks to the sort of unity and diversity that we're talking about. I don't know their values. I don't know them as humans. I don't know, what their goals are, what they're going to do. And I don't know how much any of us ultimately know deeply the roles that we're playing in all of this unfolding. So it's a yes, and I'm going to work over here where I can be effective and functional.
Thank you. David, you were there with me. Any thoughts that you wanted to share about what we experienced and how it unfolded?
Sure. Yeah, I think we had a similar reaction. I was quite vexed. That was my immediate reaction to it, because of the sense at which, we're looking at something that is, arguably the most extraordinary thing that humanity has ever encountered, and yet we're trying to figure out ways to make money off of it. It just was really distasteful at some level. But like you, with a little bit of time, I came to realize that, well, first off, if we want to get it out of the hands of the military industrial complex, having some private money come in and do that kind of research, it just research takes funding. There's no way around that. Also, the podcast that you mentioned, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it. I was just listening to that yesterday, but some points that people like Hal Puthoff were making. The potential for humanity of some of these technologies in terms of, the climate crisis or things that we can do with, metamaterials as far as medical advances, communications. There's just extraordinary potential there. In either direction, we could facilitate, turnkey totalitarianism or some kind of like utopian sort of Gaian model or participation in the Galactic Federation, like goodness knows what, right? That could go in either direction. But I think maybe that attests to the point that Robin was making about I think the significance of these different communities. You've got some groups which are a little bit more focused on the technological dimension of it, we also have to have happening in parallel, these kinds of conversations between or amongst experiencers. I think the significance of those may be that they may be or the flourishing of those may be what allow us to shift away from the kind of totalitarian, surveillance capitalism kind of model into something a little bit more what I guess utopian, you could call it. It's always a word that I'm concerned about, but certainly sort of aiming in that direction. So yeah, overall, I think the venture capital dimension is necessary. They're having spent a little bit of time in graduate school and trying scientific experiments. I know that it is the case that there are such things as dead end ideas, right? So you can think you've got a piece of the puzzle and give it everything you've got, and it just doesn't work out. And so a part of the model that we have from capitalism is that it allows us to try out a variety of different approaches, and we reward the ones that work, right? And we want to incentivize things that aren't a waste of time and energy. So yeah, I've sort of begrudgingly allowed that those things matter, and really maybe it's more a question of what's the intention behind it, right? Are we making weapon systems or control systems, or are we trying to develop technologies that'll be of benefit for us?
Respond to that. I can follow up if not.
Well,
James, let me mention quickly one thing. This line of conversation, I think, is a really useful one, actually. And so to take that kind of look back at the event and in this way, I think is great. Again, it's not about was this the right way to do it, the wrong way to do it.
Yeah.
It's about what kind of conversations can be spawned, because they're the important conversations to have.
Yeah.
It dovetails in some ways with some real thinking I was doing towards the end of last year and into the beginning of this year about the UAPDA. Just to kind of talk about that for a second. But the UAP Disclosure Act, no elements of it passed in this year's National Defense Authorization Act. There's more disappointment. I think people are kind of don't know where to go at this point legislatively. They see this couple of years worth of failures, even though there's been real wins and there was meaningful UAP legislation passed this year. A kind of a GAO review of Arrow, which especially under Kirkpatrick, I think might be an interesting thing to do, at least to show them that someone's kind of sniffing around and making sure they're doing their jobs that they were mandated to do by Congress, our elected officials. But I was thinking about the UAPDA, and I was like, I want to just put this out there. I've directly done business with many of the organizations that come up in conversations around this topic, whether it's news, government, the contractor base. I inhabited that world as part of my professional career. It wasn't the majority of my professional career, and I didn't have some like inner sanctum set of relationships there. But I got to kind of work to a degree in that realm. I held a security clearance for a while, and one goes through rugged processes to attain. And so it gives me just an additional set of filters to kind of look at all of this. And I was thinking about the UAPDA, and these thoughts have entered my head before, but it kind of just hit most cohesively because it was like, well, what can we do to move this forward? Because I'm very motivated around still doing that. And I was like, we have to be willing to look at this thing and look at it from all the stakeholder perspectives. Because I'm having done business in these realms, and you have different departments, and sometimes they don't all get along, and you have to kind of make something happen, and something that makes it work for everyone and that everyone feels kind of good about. I look at these things in terms of stakeholders. Because I've had some of that more direct experience, I'm just not wired. Maybe I'm the one who's off base, but I'm not wired to look at like certain orgs just as being these facets of evil or conspiracy or out to get us or whatever. I just, it's, not where I've fully arrived. They're very large and intricate and complex and secretive human institutions. And like all human institutions, there's humans involved. And so they often have problems. The problem is the humans involved, not necessarily three letters or whatever, right? But I was thinking about the UAPDA, like as if, who are all the stakeholders in this conversation to get the business done, for us to change tack on how society kind of addresses this topic, right? And I was like, some of the key stakeholders are these major corporations, these massive embedded government contractors that are heavily involved in the goings on of the intelligence community and the DoD. And I was like, this was based on the JFK Records Act, which was really oriented around one of the crimes of the 20th century. I think most people can agree that the assassination of JFK was like a kind of almost world-changing event, and something there's still a lot of open injury about in our society that in many ways is enmeshed with our lack of belief in society at this point. So it was a very significant event. It was a crime, and ostensibly it was to kind of get further at the crime and what can we reveal about this crime. And I was like, the key stakeholders in the UFO conversation that have existed because of institutional tendencies and just the status quo. This isn't a really good deal from their perspective as a stakeholder. They're essentially the criminal that is being investigated, that is having eminent domain, cast at them. I'm like, this deal kind of sucks if you're them, because they are stakeholders. We don't have to love or hate the exact way we've wired our capitalistic society. Again, even those defense contractors, it's like Northrop Grumman, builds the B-2 and B-21 bomber, and they also built the James Webb Space Telescope. Like, I don't know what could be more extreme. I actually live close to the Space Telescope Science Institute here in Baltimore, and I walk by, I'm like, that is like one of the crowning achievements of humanity, as far as I'm concerned, what those folks are doing with their spaceship up there. And we have to think about, like, symbolically what that says about us, that the company that can build like the things that might usher in the end of the world are also have expanded the view of humanity into the cosmos dramatically. That right there is like the human story, as far as I'm concerned, those extremes. And that's what this life is often about. But it's like, if we come to terms with the fact we live in a capitalistic society, there are these corporations, they have their interests, they are stakeholders, whether we like the way they've arrived at being that or not, they are. So what's the kind of deal we could cut legislatively if you assume that there might actually be an openness to a changing of the tone? It just has to be one that the stakeholders can walk away from the table feeling good about versus being the bad guy who gets screwed. I was like, and again, I've thought these thoughts before, but it's really coming to the fore for me now. What bill would you write that makes them, instead of putting their finger on that side of the scale, that makes the deal not happen, makes them okay with, pushing the other side of the scale and telling some reps, we're okay with this now, go for it, or even just leaving their hands off the scale entirely? Because I think we can observe the overall situation in UFOs over the last 7 years and say, these people who have come forth from government, et cetera, they probably represent the tip of an iceberg. There's probably a lot of people in those organizations, both private sector and public sector, that like this is more symbolic of kind of just a changing set of attitudes. Enough younger people who have come into these orgs. Yeah, you might have some old school holdouts and pockets or whatever, but at least it seems symbolic that a certain set of folks are ready for some shift. So let's assume those organizations might be able to go along with a shift in this, but it has to be a deal that as a stakeholder they're okay with. I think we would attack a bill like a UAPDA a bit differently. I think we'd have to inherently, and not fall into the trap where we're like, this name, this corp, this 3 letters, the federal government broadly, the deep state is this is the only way they're going to go about this. It's completely one set of views that major organization holds, and just be willing to kind of like figure out how to do the business with the elements of those orgs that could move it forward, but what it would might look differently and cast them differently, and they might come out of it differently.
I mean, so I want to reflect it right back to you. What do you think a bill like that would look like? I mean, how would we have to change the approach? I mean, is it intellectual property? Is it the eminent domain piece?
Well, let's start with that. Let's start with that. I think there's an interesting clue that's out there, and this is starting to go down the UFO geek rabbit hole. But hey, that's
Hey,
what we're
we're
here
all
for,
there.
right?
That's exactly right.
So, People might remember the Kona Blue documents that are currently available on the Arrow website and were released. They were the, potential successor program to OSAP, when it was going to not continue at DIA and through those contracts, maybe try to move it over to DHS. And there's a little reference in those docs to potential memos of understanding, MOUs and such, that might exist between the federal government and certain private sector entities, because the thinking might have been, we kind of understand someone or someone's at OSAP and BAS might have thought they might be able to transfer something out of one of the more legacy contractor environments and maybe start to normalize how that was handled a little bit more. It kind of fell apart. It didn't continue, et cetera. But it's like, okay, let's assume someone might have known what they were talking about. Let's assume even the basics would have happened. Let's say the government hands something recovered, interesting, potentially anomalous, over to a private entity and plays, potentially a lot of games around it over the decades, just kind of keep it secretive, et cetera, from a funding vehicle perspective, et cetera. And maybe that's even legal to at least the executive branch's perspective. We keep saying these are illegal programs, but the fact is the orgs running them just might not think that way. They might be like, no, this secret order because we discovered the discovery of the millennium in the mid 20th century, and we just decided to go about doing it this way. That might be how the system thinks it's been handling legally. But what are in those MOUs? Presumably some understandings of some sort that were probably documented in some way, or at least mutually understood, occurred around theoretical transfers like that. If I was a major contractor, and again, I've done business with a lot of them, et cetera, et cetera. Again, not the predominance of my career, but a sizable percentage over enough years. It's like I'd want probably the deal I agreed with the federal government to be the deal that, at least for a grandfathered period, I can continue to maintain. Like, why are we changing the deal? We have these understandings. So why not, think from a perspective of grandfathering, if for at least certain periods of time, for us to at least open our minds to the possibility that these kinds of approaches are also potentially on the table and are possible and we could pursue. They may or may not pan out or work out. There might be a lot of minutia to figure out, but it's like I haven't heard a whole lot of conversation, frankly, over the last several years of like, well, how would we move this forward if you wanted to make XYZ mega corporation happy with it when they're normally set up as the bad guy? Because another thing I've come to look at is that it probably wasn't a major defense contractor who decided to cover up UAP for the last 75, 80 years. This is a federal government policy that is being acted out decade after decade because it is the policy. From that perspective, they might be like, we've played these games at your behest for decades and decades, and now you're setting us up to look like the a-holes in the situation. So it's like, we can all have our feelings about defense contractors and wars around the world and the problems of humanity. But if we take this approach where we can also be open to understanding they are stakeholders, we live in a capitalist society, there are certain agreements that may have been made. We don't have to, inherently exclude certain sets of possibilities that might make things more palatable for key stakeholders who, whether we like it or not, are in a position where they can put their fingers on the scale, and just kind of operate in that space, even hypothetically. I think the eminent domain thing, it's like, well, what about we just reassert that those MOUs, if there are any, maintain validity for X period, that X, gang of 8 members will be read into it, and heads of certain, congressional committees will be read into those MOUs, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it could be for a limited period. We could even talk about grandfathering the financial arrangements or guaranteeing continued research abilities for certain organizations that have been at it for a while. That might not be the long-term solution. We want to open this up, but maybe they've made investments. For all we know, they've made investments in this that haven't panned out. That's a possibility. So it's like, why not give them an opportunity to get something out of maybe decades that they threw at this? Again, I don't know that to be true, But in this way of looking at things where we look at multiple sets of possibilities sort of at once, we at least have to acknowledge those other possible sets of perspectives that clearly are having probably some influence on whether this stuff is moving forward or not. And I frankly just care more about moving it forward than having to kind of solve every ill of the world in order to do that.
Those are great points, especially, I mean, for my own thinking, I'm at the point where an admission that we are in, have some way encountered, whether technologically or, being to being, are aware that there's non-human intelligence of some sort, is the key admission that needs to get made. And if that's how it gets made, so that we can begin to pivot away from does it exist or not, that conversation, I think that would be huge progress. My only reservation would be if there were crimes committed in the process of keeping these agreements. And, there's all the accusations about harassment and even violence, sometimes even murder. And those would, of course, be special cases that would have to be adjudicated legally, that I don't know that we could, secure immunity for. But I agree with you that I'm at the point where just acknowledging that this is an issue and a real conversation, I think would do wonders for our society in terms of building trust and then allowing us to have this conversation in a more constructive way. I'm interested in
Yeah.
what your thoughts are, Nathan, when you go ahead.
Oh, and I just want to say, I think it's why truth and reconciliation needs to be kind of the buzzword in our head, right? Because to
Yeah.
get to truth, the reconciliation part kind of needs to go along. And that's reconciliation from all perspectives. I mean, we think about real crimes that have been committed in world history. And the only thing that sometimes solved those situations so people could move on is truth and reconciliation.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. And I think we have to take the kind of mature adult position here that we're all culpable in some way or another in what has transpired under the names of our governments. We benefit, we're the benefactors of their decisions, whether we know what those decisions are or we don't. And so I think as this unfolds, I agree with Nick's position. We're going to have to, really put some carrots in there that make it sensible to come to a yes. But at the same time, I think we're going to find that there will be some losers, and losers are going to be those that we know just on the face of the legislation, this is going to be a loser here. And then the losers that we don't know and we will be kind of surprised by. And I think, on that front, what I'm really interested in, and I want to get, Robin's take on this in particular, is that once you've crossed over into full-on admission, and we've got these organizations that say, we have this technology, we have these bodies, we've been trying to understand it, get our arms around it. The government asks us to do this. We're trying to do this on behalf of the American people. We've been doing it for decades. We tried to do the right thing given what the circumstances were at a certain time. Well, that's great, but there are a host of things that follow just from that admission. And many of the things that follow are things that we've been hearing from the experiencer community. And this is where, can capitalism, coming back to that other part of the conversation, can capitalism truly harness the wild magic that is what happens between contact of non-human intelligence and individual humans? I don't know that it can. I think it will try. Where there is money, there will be effort, right? It will absolutely try to make money on how they can capitalize on the experience. What is it like to have an encounter? And when you're talking about technologies that we're developing now that make it such that you could be in the almost the feeling, the experience of another person, whether that be through sharing their dreams, which we are working on that technology, or just a full-on kind of immersive simulation, that's going to be sought after. What is it like? And so where does that leave the people who've had the actual encounters? Where is the justice for them if agreements have been made, which have certainly been hinted at by David Grush? Where is their voice in this conversation? And does the public side with their voice? Because then the public has sort of its own reconciliation. We as a society have said, these experiences aren't real. And we've laughed and denigrated them for a long, long time. And we marginalized them. And we said, this is not an acceptable thing to talk about. And all of a sudden, now we've got egg on our face that says, well, crap, this actually happened. Well, now I feel really awful. And we've done terrible things to these individuals. We put them in literal madhouses because of what they've encountered. And now we have to come to grips with it. It actually took place. So what does that societal reaction do to these agreements. It might just throw them in the bin, quite frankly, because we have more work that has to be done as a result of the acknowledgement that this whole thing is actually real.
Question. Robin,
Yeah,
did you want to
it's
respond?
yeah, I'm noticing how far removed I am from the conversations that have to do with what disclosure would look like and how that would go into the broader society. I the idea that any government agency will say, "Yep, the last 80 years we've covered it up. It looks like this. This is what's happened. We're going to make reconciliation and admit to it." I can examine that from like a just playing with the idea of it, but the reality of that happening seems very far outside of possibility for me. That's just me in particular, and so I don't put a lot of energy and effort towards that. And I love that people are, and I think that it's also really necessary. I feel like that it really, really needs to happen, and that I'm not the person that it's going to happen through, or that's just not the area that I look at. Again, it's the idea that, and I think it's so deeply ingrained, and I'm not pushing back against what anyone has said. I also feel, for me, it's this idea that there's still this very deeply intrinsic thing where we are supposed to be waiting for some external authority to tell us yes or no, right or wrong, this or that. And I and many other experiencers have long ago, we've had our disclosure. We've moved on from that question and that conversation. And disclosure is very important and very interesting, but I do look at it from sort of a removed perspective. Also, I don't know that I see. I don't, it's such an interesting question. I don't know that I see a future where we, humanity as a collective, or let's say the West as a collective, or those of us who are in a materialist worldview as a collective, suddenly have a realization, or over time have a realization, that these things are real and that this is happening, and that changes the paradigm, fundamentally, and that it sort of comes into the mainstream or comes into the culture. So many of these things throughout human history, these things do happen at the edges and at the fringes, and it remains slippery and elusive, and it remains a mystery, and that is its magic. And that's the call that we have in relation to it, is to go in and examine ourselves. And it happens individually, and then the individual informs the community. I'm not excited about the fringes becoming the center of society, because then it by necessity is no longer in the fringe, and it loses the sort of elusiveness that draws us into another way of looking at the world. So I imagine that there will be avenues for conversations around this. And I do think, I've had heartbreaking moments realizing that, my terror at coming out as an experiencer, imagining that without the decades of experiencers who'd come out before I told my story. I stood on the shoulders and shoulder to shoulder with people who had it much, much harder than I've had it. And there is something there that needs to be accounted for. And we have a lot of things in a very broad way in the West to account for that we still haven't accounted for. So I love that that's an idea that is being talked about and being explored. And I feel like there might be, one of my favorite phrases, which is like a secret third option that comes out of this, that is not it doesn't fit into the model that we live under. Something else emerges that we sort of can't imagine. And I think that that's the potential, that's the real potential. Otherwise, it seems like we have the possibility of just kind of going back and forth between, there's this, what I call the overculture, right? The overculture just eats and consumes all the things, and everything is assimilated. And this particular field seems to resist that. So even if there are defense contractors, and even if technology does come out of it, and even if it does come into the mainstream in a way that is more than it was, the experience of it, if someone has the actual experience of it happen to them, we're in a different paradigm. We're having a different conversation, and it's a different landscape. So I really love that the conversation is happening, and I'm really grateful that I do not have to have it because it feels above my pay grade. And I'm much more comfortable on the edge spaces over here.
Well, thank you for that. Nathan, I thought that was a great point, though. You talk about having the stakeholders involved, and the experiencers are perhaps the biggest stakeholder of all. So we can't forget that part of the equation when we're looking at trying to figure out a way, an inclusive way forward. Chris, did you have any questions you wanted to ask, or I have?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to highlight the nuance and the positivity in this conversation. I was really struck, and particularly in the first chunk of our talk, that this just feels very human and empathetic and caring. And it's amazing this happens in a space which is so stigmatized, because I wish more people will hear that. So that's my hope, is that this conversation gets out there. On that note, one of the challenges I think with our culture, on top of division, is an inherent focus on negativity. I mean, that we know humans have a psychological bias towards negative news and things like that. And certainly within this community, I think there's a lot of big promises which lead to inevitable disappointment. Your 40 whistleblowers are going to come out any day now. People get all hyped up, never happens, and then they walk away from the field. And so maybe it's something to do with being around the New Year time and reflection and a reflective mode. But I wonder for each of you, and I'll cast this question very broadly so you can answer it in whatever way feels most resonant to you. Are we making progress in, say, the past 5 years? What would you highlight as that progress, either politically or within the UAP community, or even just in your own personal interaction or understanding of that? What would you characterize as the progress that we can really point to and say that we actually have moved the ball down the field? And I'll open it up to whoever feels called to answer that.
Sure, I'll jump in. At some level, I think sort of as I'm probably speaking for everybody here, sort of the post 2017 New York Times article, there, the fact that these conversations are happening at all is indicative of like a quite extraordinary degree of progress. Uh, I My sense is that at the same, in parallel with that, uh, the powers that be may also be progressing in their ability to kind of like the donkey with the carrot on the hat, just sort of have something, this promise in front of you that you always feel like you're moving towards, and it just the goalposts just keep getting farther and farther along as you move along. So um, that may just continue indefinitely. So I think maybe this is where your question was coming from. From a certain point of view, it also seems like we're treadmilling, right? There's a feeling of progress, but it's illusory. Where I do have the sense of uh, an astonishing degree of progress is in terms of conversations like this. I have had an appetite. This is really what I've been looking for my entire life, and it's happening. Like these are really, really remarkable conversations. They're becoming more common, and if I think if there's a single marker that I would say is most significant, it's the fact that this is happening, and that people are interested in it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, the Ecosystemic Futures podcast, people check this thing out. It's on your podcast services. Anna Bradley Estevez is the person who hosted it. She works with the National Science Foundation and the Small Business Administration in terms of helping to support, seed projects around technology and science. And the conversations they're having, I've gotten beyond, let's prove it's true. I mean, so it's like that part of it is accepted. Now, granted, these guys are some people who've been involved in various programs, but they're all leading scientists and they're all at the top of their fields and they're pushing the frontiers of things. And their whole discussion is this is real. These things are going on. The government's admitted enough for us to know that there's actually something that's performing way better than anything that we can produce. And so we need to figure out how we can commercialize that and capture it and figure out how it happens. And so, that's only one small slice, but that's a very important slice in terms of what's going to drive our innovation over the next 10 years. So even if we don't get disclosure from the government, like here is the technology, I think that there are enough really bright minds right now who are engaged in thinking, well, if I was going to do that, I would have to engineer the space-time metric. Well, then how would I do that? And then eventually that leads into technological applications based on innovative theories that we've come up with ourselves just to explain away what we're seeing in the sky. So I think on that front, we're definitely seeing progress. Where I kind of despair a little bit is, of course, the political process, just because Washington is such a circus, and that you can only maintain attention for a little while, and then the whole circus moves on. And if you lost your opportunity, are you ever going to get it back? And I mean, you guys have all seen the same stuff I have, but that feels like treadmilling.
I mean, I do think strongly that, like David said, we've seen marked progress over the last handful of years, really. I think many of us are kind of probably lifers on this topic. But compared to where things were for decades, the level of evolution in the conversation publicly, but also in the corridors of power, having done some direct lobbying in DC around this topic and starting to form some relationships with various congressional staffers. I mean, like, they treat this seriously. It's not a ha ha when I'm talking to some of these folks. They seem very open and receptive to learning about the topic. They want to learn about it. They're not necessarily subject matter experts in UFOs. Um, and they themselves are trying to, I think, suss out who the right sources for information are that can help them navigate this extraordinarily, complex issue in some ways. So I'm very hopeful. The fact that you can start a UFO conversation with, oh, by the way, there's been like 5 years of federal legislation around this topic. The government is openly talking about it.
Mhm.
And frankly, again, to some people, it's not enough. It doesn't meet their definition of disclosure, which is like an open-ended thing. We get to define the disclosure that we individually want to see. Mine is really, I'd like them to acknowledge that they even think the hypothesis of certain things is on the table and that that's the official assessment. I mean, as I joke, I would, go on a vacation for a while on a beach and sip Mai Tais for a while if they even acknowledged, yeah, these are some hypotheses. This is the intelligence assessment. And while they're low confidence and there's a lot of them and there could be overlap and there could be more or combinations of these things, yeah, like, this is technically on the table. And here's how we're defining what would meet a more definitive set of criteria around determining this. And then it's like, okay, science can start cracking on this over the next century. Maybe we
Exactly.
create a space at that point where then science funding becomes more palatable to the traditional funders of, high risk, high reward science funding, and they can throw $100 million a year at UFO research that's happening out publicly. Like, I'd be fine with that. That's most of my disclosure that I personally need. And I think that's possible. We look at even this new Aero director and some of his statements, and you really have to read the interviews and listen to the hearing that he was in, and pay attention to that media roundtable that the DoD did. I mean, but if you put the time in and you see what he's saying to members of the media and to the public, he has acknowledged that. He said that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is on the table for some outlier UAP. I mean, so did Kirkpatrick at a few points. His tone, I think, changed, unfortunately, and, led away from open-mindedness. I'm not getting that sense necessarily that that's the path Dr. K 2.0, as I call him, will take. Some of the open-mindedness and just the fact that he has said some of these high, and now, like, half a dozen to a dozen, major DoD and intel officials over the last few years, these things are real. They elude our ability to fully understand what's even going on. And we don't have it all figured out, folks. Like, I think that's probably actually a fairly honest set of statements, at least broadly. And just a few more little notches, and frankly, that would be my definition of a lot of disclosure that would at least keep us busy as a society for a while. And I think it is achievable, and not everyone has to engage with it in the same way. I think a big part of allowing the space for it to occur is for that whole sidebar thing of, like, a lot of us who just know this is real and have had experiences around it, et cetera, and starting to network more and doing work around, taking that for granted. And then, okay, what are the next phases of evaluation of this and how we incorporate it into our lives? I think that actually makes it easier for the institutions to then keep moving in that direction, because it fosters that societal shift that, again, has kind of ushered them forward in making a shift of policy in a way that they communicate around it. So these shifts from the government in 3 to 4 years, plus all the legislative wins, this is unlike anything that arguably has occurred in 80 years of official inquiry into UAP. And for folks, Lou Elizondo has said it, if you have limited attention span, just come back every few years and there probably will be some progress.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I think we have made some progress. It is popping up more in conversation, and the conversations that I'm having with family and friends, like it's definitely more part of those conversations than I'd ever noticed before. Where I like to joke is sort of my litmus test of how far we've come is, does my spouse bring it up to me without me prompting her about it? And I haven't yet reached that point in our news cycle where she's saying, "Oh, I saw this, hearing, or I saw this news blurb about UAP, and what are your thoughts on that?" So, she hasn't brought that up at this point. So I don't think we're quite at the ubiquitous dinner table conversation or water cooler conversation at work about the topic. Although it might feel like that sometimes in our community that is really hyper focused on this. So, progress is being made, but I do think we've got a long ways to go. It is interesting to me that how we frame the entire sort of story here is that, like, it's our efforts that are going to sort of dictate the layout of the progression. And is that actually going to be the reality? And this is the $1 million question, or $1 billion question, I guess now. How much control do we actually have in the unfolding of this story? I don't really know the answer to that. I don't know that anybody really knows the answer to that. We've operated under, I think, largely our terms of at least when I talk about that from that standpoint. The government has had its arms around this story. I think we would agree, and they've locked it down pretty well, and they've controlled that story pretty well for decades. And they're kind of in the driver's seat of how that is unfolding. Will that continue to be the case? I'm not entirely sure. We talk a lot about in the community, will there be other world superpowers that might disclose before the US government does? What would that be like? Then we have the true wild card. What would happen if NHI were to disclose in a more overt way in our society? Some might say they already have, just that we're not quite necessarily paying attention. So these are the big questions, and what falls or flows from that kind of situation. And it's hard to, we just don't know. I mean, we can really extrapolate out from our own anthropomorphic perspective on, well, this is how we would do it if we were encountering another civilization and we had the superior technology and we didn't want to totally disrupt their world. We might try to slowly acclimate them and this, that, and the other. But I mean, there's no reason to say that they or them or all the different species that may be there that would approach this at all in the same way. So really exciting times, I think, to be in this conversation, because I do see that we are moving forward. But is it going to be this continual slow progression, or will there be kind of a punctuated black swan event? I really don't know. It'll be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the ubiquitous 26-27 prediction of the Bledsoes and the whatnot, that there's going to be something happening, and we're all slowly, teetering
I
toward
predicted that there's going to be another prediction after that prediction.
Well,
Yeah.
and Nathan, to your point about water cooler conversation there, sometimes I was shocked that we didn't get very much of that around, Grush et al. Testifying in front of Congress. And yet, one of the things that completely blindsided me was the number of colleagues who I had no idea were into any of this, who will talk about the telepathy tapes, and seeing that get up to, like, #1 on the podcast chart. So that to me is progress as well, at least in terms of open-mindedness and willing to explore, anomalous phenomenon. And sometimes it's not the marker we think it might be. So yeah.
Well, I'm really glad you
Yeah.
brought it up, because I wanted to
Yeah.
mention that. So yeah, that has been a bit of a wild card, a bit of a black swan event, and I
Mhm.
think we're going to be looking to see, can they replicate some of those
Yeah.
experiences in the laboratory, and I think she's, Kai Dickens is working hard to do that. So we'll hopefully get some answers on that front soon.
Yeah, I think, and I tend to conflate any movement socially that is like pushing toward a rethinking of the materialist paradigm, where like suddenly things are opened up and the universe isn't exactly what we thought it was, and also the sort of intellectual and scientific humbling of humanity, where we suddenly realize that science hasn't proved anything. Science isn't even in the business of proving things. It's about theorizing, and we may have some of our theories wrong, and that's okay. But anything that does that for us is going to open up a lot of these questions and enable a lot of conversations. So I view all that as absolute progress. And that's just a great podcast. Anyway, that's awesome. I love it. One of the things I wanted to ask, I mean, what was sort of interesting with all of this, with the conversations we're having about disclosure and whether, NHI will perform a reveal of its own, the drone situation. And I hate to, I mean, it's like part of it's gotten so tired that, I hesitate to even talk about it, but what is it? What do you guys think it is? What does it reflect? Something weird is going on there. I mean, we can say that much. And I believe the people who are saying that, they turn off, they seem to avoid capture, they seem to be doing things that other typical drones don't do. But is it a foreign actor? I mean, famously, the guy said it was the Chinese, and they're invading from the Tesla truck, but who knows? Anyway, anyone want to sort of take a swing at that, and how should we be thinking about the drone conundrum? I'll pick someone. All
I'll take a stab at it.
right.
I've almost tuned out.
Yeah.
It seems like there's so many possible hypotheses floating around. It's just like they're just waiting for more data to come in. But my best speculation is that it seems at least some of what's being observed has some properties characteristic of a UFO flap. Um, I think some of the events that started over at the UK air bases seem to have some correlation with escalation that was happening with the war in Ukraine and possibility of nuclear weapons moving around. We know there's strong correlation with that. And I don't remember the source. I remember hearing some, because of all of the phenomena happening around Trump's um, golf course residents. There was some parallel with what was happening with Eisenhower and his summer residence when he'd gotten elected. So it seems like there might be a UAP element to it, and then possibly also some kind of either investigative or smokescreen deployment of drone technology by defense forces or that sort of thing. So kind of, I think a mixture of things. It seems certain that it's not all UAP, but it seems to me possible that at least some of it is. Yeah, that's my best guess.
I appreciate that. I think it is the complexity is obvious, and people are seeing different things. I mean, there is misidentifications happening. People are seeing planes, but those people have also been a lot of those people have been living in New Jersey in those neighborhoods for decades and didn't see these, 6 weeks ago or whatever it was, and so they are seeing something different, not necessarily anomalous, but yeah, it's hard to know.
And
Yeah,
the government's
I'm sorry.
response,
Go on,
sorry.
David.
So just, yeah, last point I wanted to make there. The government's response to it has also just been so
So
bizarre,
weird. Yeah,
so
yeah,
weird
totally.
that
Yeah.
that's a signal in itself. Sorry, Nick, go ahead.
No, it's interesting. We talk about ontology, and obviously an element of ontologies are the labels and schemas that we use to relate to various issues and the meanings of those and the relationships between terms. And with this drone thing, we've once again kind of taken this broad label that people are using variously. They're using it to describe a variety of things. They're clinging in certain circumstances, at least initially, to the notion that fairly mundane things that are probably misidentifications are absolutely indicative of this drone thing. But the drone thing itself can mean, I mean, there have been several Chinese nationals who have been, on their way out of the country after engaging in drone activities using quadcopters over, sensitive government sites, who have been grabbed by the government and charged. They could be espionage at play. The government seems to think so. We can say that's happened. We can say misidentifications are occurring. We also have to acknowledge that drones are somewhat ubiquitously used by essentially every type of actor and agency. They cover everything from $15 toys you buy at Target to $100 million stealth, secret, crazy, fancy pants platforms and everything in between. So like UFO and now UAP, we have just another vague term that acts as sort of a catch-all. And I think we have to just be precise in what we're talking about, maintain open-mindedness. There was yet another little drone thing in Denmark, I believe, in the last day. So something does seem to be happening, but as you said, David, where the overlap and lines are between this set of phenomena, UAP, UFOs, it's kind of impossible for us to know. And we have to just be okay with that initially, I think. We have to say it is probably a variety of things. Yes, drone technology has taken leaps and bounds literally in the last 5 years, 10 years. It's changed warfare in a decade completely. It's made tanks irrelevant. And yes, nation states can launch and recover drones from sea that can elude easy capture. We also, and this is something I find interesting, the government comms have been awful, awful, just a complete mishmash. And because I think that probably indicates they don't fully understand what's going on in all of these circumstances. I looked at the original reports from Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey that I think a contractor actually had made. They were very vague. It's like, I think I saw some drones and there's some drone activity. Like, they don't always even definitively know what's going on in these circumstances and whether even some misidentifications may be coming into play that kick these things off. But against a backdrop of, yes, drones are operating for a variety of purposes. They're all over the world. And, that could be state level activities that have just entered a new phase ubiquitously. Like, we had the UAP shootdowns in February 23, we had the Chinese spy blimp. So, not needing to say it's this or that, and that it's probably more than one of these things, and maybe inclusive of things that we don't even fully understand at this point. I think that's like key. And a lot of people just really want to say it's this or that. And I think that just drives us crazy after a while, because then some little piece of evidence will come up that says, well, it pulls us further away from this or closer to it. Like, we'll just be running in circles permanently. It is probably, heterogeneous.
Yeah. I think that's, again, it goes back to the point of being able to hold that uncertainty and be okay with it. And yeah, that's important. Okay, well, the next question, of course, is Donald J. Trump. He's coming into office in a month. How does, I mean, there's so many questions you could ask about Donald Trump's second term, but how is it going to affect this discussion? I mean, there are some people who say that the chaos is a good thing, that it creates this environment where, secrets may not be so closely held, where people are feeling alienated within government, so they may be more likely to leak. Um, just wondering what your guys' thoughts are on how that might. I mean, he's also had a chance previously, and he didn't disclose then. But you've had the CIA director say some noted things on, I think it was Hannity or no, Tucker, back in the day. And so, what do you guys think? Is this going to help us or hurt us in terms of trying to move this conversation forward? Nathan, do you want to start?
Oh boy. Well, chaos, right? I mean, that's sort of the modus operandi of the Trump administration that at least we're familiar with. And I think that's probably not going to be too different with Trump 2.0. There, there are going to be a lot of folks looking for attention, and there's a lot of folks with sledgehammers going into these agencies trying to really shake things up. And I think many Americans, most Americans would agree that there's a very low trust in government right now, that a lot of our institutions have kind of failed the American people. How to go about correcting those problems, like that's a very different, you'll get different perspectives on that. How do we course correct from some of our missteps there. In terms of UAP disclosure, it's really interesting, and I would really more so focus on the things that he has said thus far about it, and also kind of contextualize what he said alongside other presidents who've been asked the same questions about UAP. Their body language is fascinating. They're all a little bit cagey. Trump, in particular, a person that really has never been lacking in words or wanting to grandstand about something or go on and on about something. It gets pretty tight-lipped about what he knows or doesn't know about this particular topic. He's used phrases like, I don't particularly think there's much to it, but I did have these fancy folks come and talk to me who are Air Force pilots, and they were Top Gun people, and they told me what they saw. It's an interesting way to, I think, tell his side of the story. He doesn't seem to want to embellish it, which is odd because he often is prone to embellishment, right? So this is where he's like, being much more disciplined than I would expect him to be on most topics. So that tells me there's something to it. What exactly it is, I'm not entirely sure. And of course, there's a lot of speculation in the community about what does the president actually know, and how much should the president know, to be honest with you, a person who's in that office every few years and potentially is out the door, where we have these institutions that have a lot longer lifespan than that, and they have bureaucrats who we entrust to carry that torch and guard our closest secrets. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting. I think what we could safely say is it will be wild. Something will happen, and what I worry the most about is do the things that happen muddy the waters more than they already are, and I'm worried that that might be the case. I'm also particularly looking at folks that are in Congress that are Trump, in the Trump camp, and I was very frustrated, to be honest with you, at the latest hearing, considering that it came a year or so after Grush had spoken to Congress, and the types of questions and the what we seem to know or don't know hasn't really advanced much from then. And I find that to be, quite frankly, pretty baffling given Grush's credentials and the things that he was sharing with Congress at that time. There didn't seem to be a great deal of follow-up, or if there had been, that follow-up hasn't made its way into the public conversation. So again, all these are interesting factors. Like what is really taking place? What do lawmakers actually know? And to be conspiratorial, you can say there's just more to it than they're willing to share. And what exactly is that?
Nick, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that, being as you're so close to the ground in DC.
Well, it's interesting having I went to both the House and that Senate hearing that Senator Gillibrand held with the Senate Armed Services Committee subcommittee. And so, the tone was radically different between the two. I think some of the House members that we saw, with their lines of questioning, both in the original hearing and what they've said subsequently, and then in this latest hearing, in many ways it dovetails some of the ideological rhetoric that the quote unquote right has embraced. The notion of the deep state and using that terminology versus like it is, I think, Nathan, you said bureaucracy. Like it's like, yeah, the people who work for the government, like countries have those people, right? So um they're able to kind of use it in a way, some of them, that they can incorporate that messaging a little more easily maybe than kind of a strict institutionally minded person. And so it at least I don't think necessarily you know, changes radically the set of dynamics that are at play as the new administration comes in. As was said, like I think, yeah, there is a little bit more of a tendency to want to stir the pot, and if some interesting things pop out of it, that could well occur. How they're cast, and the why it's cast in a certain way, I think we'll have to still scrutinize. But I think it certainly keeps those possibilities on the table. How do you motivate such an administration to do certain things? Again, as Nathan commented on, I think Trump's tone around this topic has been fascinating to observe in the interviews he's in. It's almost like it's like a different guy for a minute,
Yeah.
and he talks about it, and then you're like, wait, who was that dude who just showed up to talk about UFOs who looked like Donald Trump? It was like just a different tone. So, you know, uh, could he move it forward? For all we know, he could have been told by the CIA, yeah, the aliens are here, and Trump, being Trump, like just himself doesn't feel that there's anything to it. And so that's the view that he expresses. Maybe he's being told different things and just disagrees with them. Or maybe he's BSing and knows what's going on, and it differs from his public stance. Um, I know from my own efforts, because a lot of them are, legislative branch oriented. It's about getting our elected officials just a little more engaged in the process. Um, on some level, I can avoid thinking too much about what's going on at the executive level. Like if we get some language in the NDAA, probably the president will sign it because the presidents tend to sign NDAA bills, and that's kind of regardless of party. And so it's like I think there's just a lot of other moving parts, that there's still just a lot of levers and buttons to manipulate, and we should just keep doing that and be open-minded to this administration potentially making a policy change. And just to continue looking at it like that. There is a policy. It's somehow survived multiple sets of administrations for a long time, potentially. And this is another one that probably has its reasons for sticking with that. It did the first time they were in office. Is there a way to change the dynamics at play so they're more willing to shift in how this is handled?
Well, thank you for that. We're coming up on 2 hours. I wanted to hear a final thing from each of you, hopefully, about the upcoming year. And Robin, I wanted to start with you. I feel like in the last few minutes, maybe we were talking out of your area of interest, and I wanted to kind of bring it back to your bailiwick. One of the things that I focus almost in my own personal research on consciousness and trying to prepare myself for what I think the universe actually is, rather than what I've been taught in school and whatnot. And for me, there is a looming question of whether or not there is a kind of contact from this other, whatever it is, that's occurring, and it may be increasing over time. Maybe the intensity is increasing. There's talk of astrological alignments that may be encouraging certain energetic things that are going on. How should people prepare if there is this other that we're going to be contacting increasingly? From your perspective, is there anything people can do outside of the political sphere, outside of agitating for disclosure, where they can be in a better personal or spiritual position to accommodate this contact if and when it occurs?
Thank you so much. And yeah, it is outside my area of expertise, but I'm definitely interested. Like, I'm learning a lot today, hearing everyone speak about all of this. What I've seen personally and in the groups that I'm in is that people are having more, I can't speak across the board, of course, but just what I'm seeing, people seem to be having more experiences. And my experiences have ramped up. And people who've never had experiences of any kind before are starting to. And I'm calling 2025 the weirdest timeline with the most potential, because as reality starts to crack in these ways, it's an enormous moment to look at secret third options and do things differently. And I think that what is really needed in order for individuals to go through that process is really good community and really nuanced and sophisticated frameworks to think about these things. And we have that, we really do. Like, it's available to us in a way that I hadn't seen it before. There are people having these really nuanced, like this conversation today to me is an event, and it would be even if we were all just sitting in a room together, not recording it, that these things are important. And so what the invitation for me is always to turn back towards the self and back towards, how are we navigating the extraordinary unfolding that's happening, and how are our relationships? And it seems very mundane. And when I was sort of coming to terms with my own experiences, I kind of rejected that. It's like, I would like a better option that is, that seems as dramatic as what is unfolding. But it really does feel to me like stabilizing in our own experiences and worldviews, being able to hold more liminality and paradox, widening the aperture of what the nervous system can handle. Like, for me, somatics plays a huge role in this. I don't know how to operate in this landscape without doing somatics and shadow work and personal development and all of these things. And then watching all of that come together in community so that we can have differing opinions or have discussions like everyone has been talking about, and not collapse the narrative, because we're not going to be able to. It's getting harder and harder to say what's real and what's not real. And so our own experience and our relationships, I think, are going to become more and more important. And I am very aware that there are predictions. Like, I've had that experience as well, that it's all going to come to an end in 2020, 2012, or all of that. And I'm feeling 2027 approaching. And for me, that's a time period that seems really potent. And as kind of unsexy as it is, like, sort of holding a groundedness through all of the extraordinary unfolding seems like a really important thing for us to do if we can, for those of us who can.
Thank you for that. Mr. Stuss, how about you? What for the upcoming year? What are you looking forward to? What do you think, may or may not happen? What do you think is important? How do you want to sign off on this conversation today?
Well, the short answer is what Robin said. It's just
Right?
perfectly put. Yeah. I'm excited about 2025. I probably should be more trepidatious, all things considered, but I couldn't tell you why. I do have a feeling of excitement about it. Um, I think I love the expression Robin used, widening the aperture of what the nervous system can handle. This really feels to me very significant. And I have a sense that you know mostly through media like this, this kind of like social networking technology, that there's this kind of rapidly spreading mycelial support network, in which you're getting interconnections between people who are really have undertaken some very deep inquiry, and then are suddenly able to like access each other's resources, which is leading to like a kind of like unprecedentedly rapid spread of very subtle understanding and awareness. In a sense, we're kind of like at some level collectivizing the understanding of this very weird thing, which is underway. So yeah, I think that's probably why I feel hopeful about it, but also a sense of responsibility. That there's something about, like Robin was saying, about the inner work, returning to the self, um, and not getting too lost in the hyper normalizing, barrage of information that's coming at us every day. But yeah, spending a little bit more time, or making a practice out of grounding, opening up, and I'll just throw this out there. I have a sense that there's something, it's like, to use we started with McKenna, and to come back to it. His notion of an archaic revival, that there's uh, a kind of epistemic humility that we're in the process of acquiring, in which maybe like I think we use the phrase in some of our earlier conversations, the steamy affair that we've had with Western civilization, materialism, and sort of the Enlightenment thinking, that's coming to an end, and we're starting to actually reintegrate some of these perspectives that most other cultures seem to just have understood, and opening up to the notion that there may be intelligences all around us. They've always been here, and so yeah, I don't know that that's going to happen collectively in the immediate future, but I do have the sense that something like that is approaching. So yeah, all of these things make me uh, trepidatiously positive.
Nathan, what about you? 2025 and the sign off on today's chat.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's been an amazing conversation. I knew I would enjoy this one, and I was not wrong. It's just been great chatting with all of you. 2025, I have no idea. 2024 was a wild year for me. I was really plunged into the middle of Hurricane Helene. I live in Nashville, and so that really rocked our world. And what that taught me is a lot of the things that Robin is speaking to, and that is that you can prepare and you can try to prepare, but when it happens to you, you're sort of left looking for who can help, right? And I'm grateful that there are a lot of folks who are having conversations like this, who will be in positions to help when things that may happen that are maybe destabilizing, that they'll be able to have those conversations or hold space for these conversations in families and communities where they need to take place. It's very challenging when your world has changed, and I guess in some ways, we think of the apocalypse as sort of like, oh, it's the end of everything, but it's really this birthing process. And it's just like when you talk to parents, you ready to be a parent? Well, I have no idea, but when the child is
Yeah.
there, you got to take care of that child,
Yeah.
and every day you got to do something, right? So that's really what I sort of try to put into practice, is that I can't necessarily prepare for the future, but I need to be present in the moment, I need to understand how, my body is reacting to just everyday things. Energetic grounding is hugely important. I think we don't do enough of that. Most of our grounding is spent just doing this on our cell phones. It's not really grounding at all. We're just projecting out and living somewhere else. So, taking more moments to be still and calm and away from stimulation and just kind of feeling into yourself, going inside the interior space. And on that note, I think that's where I side just generally with this entire topic, right? There are always going to be lights in the sky. There's always going to be something fantastical, something beyond our ken that we just don't understand. That's the nature of reality. It's always a little bit out there. And to get too fixated on that, I think is a mistake. And I think we need to be more present to just being and accepting where we are and finding charity and grace for ourselves, because trying to arrive at an understanding, a correctness, a right belief, a resolution to all uncertainty, like it's just the wrong way to approach life, in my opinion. So maybe shifting a little bit away from that and being more comfortable with just things as they are is going to prepare us for whatever may come.
Nick, you're up.
The word I think it was in the podcast that you referenced, James. It has ecosystems in its name, and that's a term I use as a framework to think about the UAP issue, UAP, NHI, experiencer, et cetera, et cetera. It's we probably can't get to the bottom of certain types of things that are occurring. But the moment you operate in the space where you're like, people do have these experiences, the government has acknowledged at least these objects appear to be real. There could be more going on than that. It gives us a set of potential frameworks. I think using an ecosystems based framework is a sound one to start to take this on. And maybe it takes decades or centuries for us to kind of adapt around this thinking. But there actually that would tell us something for sure if that indeed was the case, that there are NHI and whether they're domestic or come and go, whatever. Instantly we would know that the ecosystem is quite a bit broader and includes a more diverse set of entities, characters, than the kind of the framework is currently allowed for. I always go back to like the discovery of microorganisms and the germ as like probably the best analog we have in some ways, because it's like we had a sense of those things before we made those discoveries. We called them either miasma or demons or whatever. We knew something was kind of going on. And it ended up being that there was an element of the ecosystem that we were interacting with and was everywhere and kind of ubiquitous on this invisible layer all around us, inside of us, that simply existed and always had. And if you kind of do the inverse of that and look at the UAP situation as maybe like the mirror, but turned the other way, um, like I don't know why that's not a great framework to use to look at this as well and just say there is this kind of invisible, so to speak, set of phenomena, at least for people on a daily basis for the most part. Yet it kind of seems ubiquitous. It kind of seems like it's always been around. It kind of always seems like maybe it's been part of the so-called ecosystem. And even just operating in that space and kind of meditating on it in just that sense, I think some interesting things emerge from that because if we use an ecosystems based approach, things evolve into certain niches and do certain things amongst ecosystems in a way that's highly networked with many other layers of the ecosystem, many other points, and we might be able to ask ourselves, well, if these are part of the ecosystem and we're part of the ecosystem and microorganisms are part of the ecosystem, what set of hypotheses might we be able to generate about the ecosystem broadly and what it actually begins to start to look like? And what role do these things in the ecosystem play? And how are we networked with those things in the same way we're networked with microorganisms? I like using the word meta-organisms to describe what these things might be, because like you're kind of not going to be wrong. It is like that next layer of organisms. And whether they're, again, they stick around a little more. I mean, some microorganisms are more confined to a place, or whether they travel around more, and some microorganisms are a little more mobile than others. We still can kind of categorize it in that way that allows us to have a useful framework. We don't have germs all figured out. We don't have fungi all figured out. We don't have, yet we did shift our thinking dramatically to accommodate that understanding of the world. And I think in the same vein, we can look at UAP, et cetera, that way and say, we're not going to have it all figured out. This is the beginning of a new kind of phase of inquiry, frankly, that we're at the baby stages of. But we can look back on what accommodating microorganisms did for the human race and say, I'm kind of glad I live in a realm that's, achieved that level of understanding. And I think that maybe harkens to some positivity that can come out of even just broad acknowledgments as it relates to this topic without having to know every detail and feel it's been completely conquered, because that is how we live our lives in a realm where we don't fully understand what's going on, but we can at least have a broad model that works for us and maybe sets a tone for the future inquiry.
Yeah, awesome. Chris, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, I'm going to riff a little bit on what Robin said with this year of great potential. It certainly feels like there's a lot of potential energy in the air, whether either through just prosaic psychology, things like, fourth turning theory, social ideas, or something more esoteric. And I think we're starting to see this, that the existing structures and systems are just letting people down so much. People are very angry and they're hitting rock bottom. And you can see this come out in places of acts of violence, which we're certainly seeing as the news cycle comes into 2025. But I also see it as energy that can be exploited for positivity. Like in my own workplace, we're finding people hungry for community and in transformative ways. And so I put that as a challenge to everyone in our community to be aware of your own energy and lean into those positive aspects. And I think we're going to see some real revolution and transformation, which might impact our topic in ways that we don't experience through people reconnecting with one another and finding wonder in sharing and open-mindedness, even from just new ways of being socially. So I really love hearing everyone talk about that grounding and being aware of your own self, but also how you are choosing to interact with others. And I'm, despite all the blackness out there, I'm really quite hopeful because it feels like we've gone as far as we can in this old way. And it's been a privilege to be part of conversations like this. And I hope we can all find space for this in our own lives, whether it's UAP related or not. So thank everyone for their time today. It's been a joy to be part of this, and looking forward to where our community goes in the next year.
Amen to that. Thank you guys for a fantastic conversation. This went places I never thought. So I appreciate all of you. Each one of you, you brought something really important.